It's difficult when traditions have to be altered. You may be wrestling with how this pandemic is going to affect your upcoming holidays. It's difficult when traditions have to be altered. We lean on those traditions and we take strength and comfort from them, and they're difficult to change. And yet there can be valid reasons for doing so. Maybe you've altered traditions in order for a family to more easily adjust to the loss of one of your family members. The year my dad died, my sister simply fixed spaghetti for Christmas at her house, just so we didn't go through the same process. Or sometimes we make a change to accommodate a special need of someone that we care about deeply. Of course, this year puts a totally different spin on the quandary and creates some really tough choices. If you're interested in getting together via Zoom and discussing this issue with others, I'm attempting to put together such a discussion. Let me know via text or email, and we'll see if there's enough interest to move ahead. If you need my personal info, it's available in the digital bulletin that you receive each week. But our decisions about the holidays revolve around discerning. And that's the word that I'd like for us to focus on and to think about today. By definition, it's the ability to judge well. And certainly for a Christian, that's in the context of including the willingness to be led by God in that judgment. But what a challenge! The challenge to make a wise choice. What a wonderful thing to model, though. What a gift you can give to a child or somebody who's watching you. Not the answer, but the ability to arrive at an answer. Especially during COVID, there are so many judgment calls, more so as the situation becomes more critical. But it does appear that there's hope on the horizon. Paul wanted the Philippians to be able to do this well. He wanted them to know how to discern. And so he tells them in Philippians chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, "And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ." And look at all the things that are included in that brief passages. Paul prayed about it. Something we should all be doing, asking God for his guidance, asking God to give us the ability to discern for our decisions and the decisions of others as well. Paul talks about love abounding, and that certainly happens when we make the right judgments. We especially are benefited through knowledge and depth of insight, and those two are so connected. The more you know, the more you're able to have insight and can see beyond the obvious. And it gives us the ability to discern more effectively, to determine what is best. And through those good judgments, we are pure and blameless because we're making a series of spiritual decisions that prepare us to be with the Lord. You know, you only have to go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And there Solomon writes, "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens." And then we look at that listing. Time to be born, die, plant, uproot, kill, heal, tear down, build up, weep, laugh, mourn, dance, embrace, refrain from embracing, search, give up, keep, throw away, tear, mend, to be silent, to speak, love, hate, war, peace. And probably if you're like a lot of people, you stop at the end of that verse and go, well, how do I know the difference? Well, it's discernment. It doesn't make it easy, but that's the kind of decisions that we have to make. We have to discern the time. Is this the right time for this particular thing? You know, it could be right or it could not be right. And in another time, another circumstance, and we consider the needs, we consider the best options, we consider what a loving response would be, and then we have to make that judgment call. What's the right thing to do right now. Jesus presented a couple of brief parables that address this issue, and they're shared in the context of fasting, a future responsibility, because the circumstances are going to change. Starts in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 14. Then John's disciples came and asked him, "How is it that we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast?" Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom mourn while he is with them? The time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. Then they will fast." Jesus says, it's not time to fast right now. I'm here right now, but in the future I'll be gone, and that's the time for fasting. And then, as he is so likely to do, he's going to illustrate that point with a couple of really brief presentations. He says in verse 16, "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse." And then he uses another analogy in verse 17. "Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved." Now, both of these analogies are a bit of a quandary for us because neither of them really fit into our daily lives or the way that things work in our lives. I have a favorite shirt, a favorite dress shirt. It's one that I like so very much. I like to wear it as much as possible, but recently it got a tear in the back. It got torn in the washing machine, just about a 2-inch tear. Now, in Jesus' story, I would have needed to have matched the material and matched the age of the material. The shirt's about 5 years old. But my world is different from that world. So what did I do? Well, I ordered some Bondex from Amazon and I repaired the shirt. Sure, it's limited and it likely won't last as long as it would have, but it works and I'm grateful. But it points up the fact that we have to make sure that we understand the context of the analogy. And in the handmade cloth and the cloth that would have aged, Jesus' story and his point is very valid. And then he switches over to wineskins. Now, there may be others who have experience with this. I don't have any at all, so I read some about it. Obviously, there's a fermentation process, and the vessel has to be able to handle that process. Now, we can assume that in Jesus' time, there were folks who learned the hard way about the old wineskins and lost out. They lost the wine and they lost the wineskin. Now, this passage came up in a class I was teaching one time, and I had a class member say, "Why would you want to keep old wineskins if you couldn't use them again?" Well, they could still hold liquid, like water or milk or olive oil. You obviously didn't want to have that experience of losing both the wine that you were trying to prepare and the wineskin that had value. Jesus here is trying to help us understand some things. And I think there are things that we can learn. First of all, there's consequences to the judgments that we make. Again, you could lose the wine, you could lose the wineskins, and that's a consequence. There's a poem that all of us probably recognize. Many of us maybe could say parts of it. It's called The Road Not Taken. "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler long I stood, and looked down on one as far I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and want wear. Though as for the passing there, had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. yet knowing how way leads onto way, I doubted I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Some were ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. Of course, that was written by Robert Frost. It was published in 1916, just before the flu epidemic would hit America from February of 1918 to April of 1920. About the same kind of circumstances that we're facing now. A simple choice as to which road to take wound up having consequences. In connection with this poem, many people point out the fact that Robert Frost had a friend, an English poet, by the name of Edward Thomas. And Frost had sent to Thomas an advance copy of this poem in 1915. And many believe that the poem was significant in Thomas's decision to enlist in World War I. And Thomas was killed in battle 2 years later. Our choices, based on discernment, have consequences. The other thing that Jesus is trying to teach us in this wineskin illustration is that there are things you can't simply add on. I've heard teachers in evangelism situations say to the student, well, you wouldn't have to change much. And whether that's true or not, it's a questionable perspective. We sometimes require a clean sweep, a total commitment. And certainly when we're giving our lives to God, I think that application would obviously be there. But in discernment as well, we recognize that sometimes that's exactly what's required. People find it difficult to make a major change. I read a few years ago that follow-up research for people who had open heart surgery found that only about 10% of them actually changed their lifestyle following surgery. You would think that going through that would make somebody so aware of a lifestyle change. And many probably would begin in that way, but they wouldn't really stay that way. Jesus is calling for something new, to discern that it's time for a new approach, for a new level of commitment. Now, often there are times when discernment is complex. Some of you right now are wrestling with the idea of, well, what do we do about church, and especially the assembly and public worship? And that is an individual decision that requires the willingness and the ability to discern. Different people and different families have come to different decisions. And maybe even some have had to alter their original decisions based on changing circumstances. For me personally, the rising numbers and the strain on our healthcare system are daunting. There are voices shouting that if the numbers rise in the pattern expected, then the healthcare system could be overwhelmed. That's a serious threat. And all of us have to look at really what is the right judgment. How do we use discernment? The other thing that's so critical there is that we allow each other to make those decisions. We support each other in the discernment that is coming from them. It's easy for us to look at somebody else and say, well, they should be doing this. But that's not the way it works. All you have to do is look into Romans chapter 14 and 15, and you find all kinds of evidence that as Christians, we're supposed to give other people the right to discern. Romans chapter 14 verse 4 refers to the fact, who are you to judge someone else's servant? We're reminded that each of us are to be fully convinced in our own mind, Because in verse 12, we're told that each of us will give an account. And then you go into chapter 15 and go down to verse 7 where we're admonished to accept one another. There are standards, there are boundaries, but they're individual boundaries. And if somebody out there isn't making the choice that you're making, remind yourself that it's their choice. It's their discernment that's important. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 31 says, "But if we were more discerning with regard to ourselves, we would not come under such judgment." Now, this is in the context of how the Corinthians are engaging in the Lord's Supper. And we know from reading that full passage that it's almost embarrassing the way the Corinthian church was behaving. We create so many issues because we don't discern. We don't adequately think through what could happen, or even what's likely to happen. Do we really believe that the church of Corinth wanted to have all those problems? My guess is that they just didn't really anticipate what the outcome might be. Apparently, from what's written in those two books, they're proud and haughty people. Maybe even to the point of not considering that they could even be wrong. And what a trap that became for them. And so Paul, in writing to them, says, you need to learn to discern. Make a good judgment. Making the best judgment doesn't come easily. And there isn't anybody who's going to do it all the time. But when we mess up, we can have impact for a very long time. Not just for us, but for our loved ones. Others are impacted by our actions and choices, and that's why it's so critical that our discernment be active and powerful, and that it has the full force of all our concentration. We sometimes feel like we're left off by ourselves to make hard choices and to make tough decisions and to really determine those judgments that are so critical. But the truth is, it's a spiritual thing. We are blessed to be watched over and led by God and to be directed by the Holy Spirit. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 14. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit. If there are things that are disturbing, if there are things that are confusing, be sure to bring God and God's Spirit into that process so that He can lead, so that He can affect your decision-making process, so that you can make those good judgments you want to make. I believe that all of us want to make right judgments. We want to be discerning individuals. And we do that by giving it our focus and giving it our time, but also by being willing to yield to God so that we're led by His Spirit in making those critically important judgments. Would you pray with me? Dear God, we thank You for our minds. We thank You for the fact that we can process information. We thank You that we're able to make good judgments if we will focus on how to do that. But Father, beyond that, we thank You for the more complex and the more complicated judgments, that Your Spirit enters into that process as well. And that if we will allow You through Your Spirit to be an active partner in the decision-making process, then we can put ourselves in the position where we make the judgments that You would have us make. Please help us to do exactly that. And we pray this through your precious Son.